For more than 4 centuries, Britain's story has been written on water. Long before empires, before flags planted in distant soil, the fate of the island nation depended on wood, rope, wind, and courage. Ships carried trade, war, survival land, sometimes the quiet desperation of people with nothing left to lose. Among them was a vessel never meant to become legendary. Her name was the Mayflower.
She was not built for glory, measuring just over 106 feet in length and 25 feet across the beam. The Mayflower was a merchant ship, sturdy but unremarkable, designed to carry cargo, not history. Her hull was thick, her timbers tightly fitted, her design practical rather than elegant. In an age where the sea killed without warning, survival mattered more than beauty. Yet even with careful construction, she remained painfully small against the oceans she would face, and from her earliest voyages, the sea made that fact brutally clear. On one of her first recorded journeys, the Mayflower sailed heavily laden through the North Sea, her decks crowded with goods bound for foreign markets. Then the storm came, winds howled. Waves slammed into her sides with relentless force. Water surged across the deck. The weight of her cargo dragged her lower and lower into the sea. Faced with disaster, her master, Christopher Jones, made a desperate decision. Cargo valuable, insured, and contracted was thrown overboard to keep the ship afloat. The Mayflower survived, but survival came at a cost that would haunt Jones for years. When the voyage ended, Jones did not return as a triumphant captain. He returned to lawsuits. Accusations of negligence followed him, questioning whether the cargo truly needed to be sacrificed or whether poor judgment had led to unnecessary loss. The sea may have spared the ship, but society did not spare the man. For nearly a decade afterward, Jones avoided risky voyages, keeping the Mayflower closer to familiar waters, hauling wine, cloth, and supplies along safer coastal routes. It appeared that both man and ship had learned a hard lesson about ambition, yet history rarely announces itself in advance. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as a business proposition, carrying consequences no one can fully understand. In 1620, a group of men came seeking Christopher Jones. They were not merchants, and they were not nobles. They did not speak of profit margins or trade routes. They spoke instead of faith, fear, and a future that no longer existed for them in England. These men belonged to a radical religious group, separatists, who refused to worship under the authority of the Church of England. Their crime was not violence or rebellion, but belief. For that, they had been fined, imprisoned, and driven from their homes. England, to them, had become unlivable. Surveillance followed their gatherings. Worship had to be hidden. Families were torn apart by arrests and intimidation. Eventually, many fled to the Netherlands, where religious tolerance offered temporary safety. But even there, the ground beneath them felt unstable. Spain loomed as a threat, and memories of persecution were too fresh to ignore. Tolerance, they knew, could vanish as quickly as it appeared. The idea of America was whispered among them like a forbidden hope. The New World was dangerous, unforgiving, and infamous. Jamestown struggled to survive. Roanoke had vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. Ships disappeared, colonies starved, disease and exposure killed indiscriminately. To leave Europe for America was not an act of optimism, it was an admission that staying meant something worse. If this story is gripping so far, take a moment to click the subscribe button and like this video. It helps more people discover these forgotten moments where ordinary decisions quietly reshape the world. Permission was required. No English ship sailed west without the king's approval. King James I, though hostile to religious dissent, saw opportunity where others saw nuisance. Allowing these troublesome believers to leave England removed a problem and potentially expanded English claims abroad. Approval was granted, but it came wrapped in conditions that would bind the travelers 2 years of hardship. Financing followed, but with strings attached: 7 years of unpaid labor, shared profits, and the forced inclusion of passengers who did not share the Pilgrims' faith. These outsiders were labeled strangers. They were craftsmen, laborers, and adventurers necessary for survival, but distrusted by the religious core of the group. From the beginning, tension simmered. Faith held the Pilgrims together, but fear of disorder hovered just beneath the surface. 2 ships were selected for the journey, the Mayflower, experienced and seaworthy, and a smaller vessel, the Speedwell, meant to accompany her across the Atlantic. Together, they would carry families, children, supplies, tools, and a fragile dream toward an uncertain horizon. But even before they left England's waters, trouble began to show its hand. The Speedwell leaked, not a minor inconvenience, but a persistent failure that no amount of repair seemed able to fix. The ship set sail, turned back, sailed again, turned back again. Each delay drained supplies, each repair consumed money. Each setback pushed the calendar closer to the dangerous Atlantic season, when storms grew stronger and daylight shorter. William Bradford, one of the Pilgrims' leaders, began to suspect something darker. Perhaps the crew of the Speedwell had intentionally sabotaged the ship, fearful of the crossing and eager to abandon the voyage without blame. Whether sabotage or incompetence, the result was the same: the Speedwell could not continue. A brutal decision followed. The weaker ship was abandoned. Some passengers gave up and stayed behind. The rest were forced onto the Mayflower, crowding her decks far beyond what she was designed to carry. Men, women, children, livestock, supplies all compressed into a floating wooden box. Privacy vanished, space disappeared, the air below decks turned stale and foul. And still, they had not yet reached the most dangerous part of the journey. They were now late enough that winter storms would chase them across the Atlantic. Late enough that arriving in America would mean building shelter in freezing conditions. Late enough that turning back would mean financial ruin and certain persecution. Every path forward narrowed until only one remained. The Mayflower waited in port, heavy with human lives and heavier still with unspoken fear. Those who stepped aboard understood something few dared to say aloud. Once the ropes were cut, there would be no rescue, no relief, and no certainty of land ever appearing again. The sea does not forgive hesitation, and soon, the Mayflower would sail alone into it. The Mayflower did not depart in celebration. There were no cheering crowds, no triumphant speeches, no certainty of return. As the ship finally slipped away from the English coast in September 1620, silence dominated the deck. Those on board watched the shoreline fade, knowing that everything familiar: language, law, protection, memory was receding behind them. Ahead lay only water and the fragile promise of a place none of them had ever seen. As days turned into weeks, discipline began to fray. Some of the strangers, emboldened by the lack of clear authority, openly questioned why they should obey rules once they reached land. If the ship landed outside the territory authorized by the king, they argued, then no English law applied. The Pilgrims listened carefully. Without unity, survival would be impossible. But imposing unity required authority, and the authority at sea was fragile when land was still a rumor. Illness followed stress as surely as night followed day. Coughs spread, fevers lingered. One passenger died during the crossing, a reminder that the ocean demanded payment even before arrival. Yet remarkably, most survived the journey itself, a testament to stubborn resilience rather than comfort or care. Land was first sighted in early November, not the Virginia territory they were permitted to settle, but the rocky coastline of Cape Cod. Relief washed through the ship, followed almost immediately by fear. They were off course. Landing here meant legal uncertainty, political risk, and the possibility of confrontation with unknown peoples. But the sea behind them had grown too dangerous to challenge again. Storms blocked any attempt to sail south. Anchoring near Cape Cod forced the issue. Before anyone set foot ashore, the tensions that had simmered for weeks threatened to boil over. Some passengers declared openly that once on land, No one had authority over them. The fragile social fabric holding the group together began to tear, thread by thread. In response, the Pilgrim leaders acted swiftly. Knowing that survival required cooperation, they drafted an agreement, a simple but profound document. The Mayflower Compact bound the men together into a civil body politic, pledging obedience to laws made for the common good. It was signed aboard the ship, before disembarkation, not as a grand declaration of democracy, but as a desperate attempt to prevent collapse before the first house was even built. With the agreement signed, exploration began. Small parties went ashore to search for fresh water, shelter, and signs of habitation. They found abandoned villages, cleared fields, and burial mounds, evidence that others had lived and died there before. The land was not empty, it was silent, and silence carried its own warnings. Winter closed in quickly, cold rain-soaked clothes, snow followed. Each return to the ship brought exhaustion and dread. Shelter had not yet been built, food supplies were shrinking. And still, the question lingered unanswered: who had lived here before, and where were they now? The Mayflower remained anchored offshore, a temporary refuge that could not last forever. Disease began spreading among those who stayed aboard. Exposure weakened even the strongest. Each passing day delayed construction, and each delay increased the likelihood that spring would never come for many of them. The crossing had not ended their ordeal. It had merely delivered them to its most dangerous chapter yet. From the deck of the Mayflower, the shoreline looked deceptively calm: low hills, pale sand, forests stripped bare by approaching winter. But beneath that stillness lay danger the passengers could sense even if they could not name it. They were not where they were supposed to be, their royal patent authorized settlement in Virginia, not this northern, unfamiliar coast. Every legal protection they thought they possessed dissolved the moment the anchor dropped. The signing of the Mayflower Compact had restored order for now, but it could not change geography, climate, or fate. Exploration parties ventured inland cautiously. Muskets were carried at all times. The men moved through frozen soil and tangled brush, discovering corn buried in baskets, tools left behind, and graves marked only by the shape of the earth. The land had been lived on recently. Entire villages stood empty, their inhabitants gone without explanation. Some saw this as divine providence, others felt unease tighten around their throats. A place does not empty itself without reason. One night, while exploring further inland, the men were attacked. Arrows cut through the darkness, the English fired back blindly. No one was killed, but the message was unmistakable: they were not alone, and they were being watched. Fear followed them back to the ship, settling into every conversation, every whispered prayer. If winter did not kill them, conflict might. Despite this, construction began. They chose a site near fresh water and began cutting timber for crude shelters. Progress was painfully slow. The ground was frozen solid, tools broke, hands bled. Men returned to the ship each night exhausted, soaked, and increasingly ill. Exposure and malnutrition weakened immune systems already battered by weeks at sea. Coughs deepened, fevers worsened, strength faded. Disease spread faster than walls could be raised. By December, death became routine, not dramatic, not heroic, quiet. One by one, passengers stopped rising from their bedding. They were buried at night to hide the scale of loss from any watching eyes beyond the trees. Graves were leveled to disguise how many had fallen. By winter's deepest point, nearly half of the original passengers and crew were dead. The Mayflower, once a symbol of escape, became a floating infirmary. Those too weak to work remained aboard, slowly wasting away. The ship's captain, Christopher Jones, watched the disaster unfold from the water, aware that his responsibility now extended far beyond navigation. This was no longer a voyage, it was a slow-motion reckoning. If you're finding this story powerful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring these real human stories, often lost beneath myth, to more people who deserve to hear them. And still, the plan continued to unravel. Food supplies dwindled dangerously. Fishing was difficult in icy waters, hunting yielded little. Each death reduced the workforce, slowing construction further, which in turn exposed the living to even harsher conditions. Morale collapsed, faith was tested not in sermons, but in frozen fingers and empty stomachs. Yet survival often turns on moments no one plans. In early spring, as the survivors struggled to endure another week, a lone figure walked into their settlement. He was indigenous, barely clothed, calm, unafraid, and he spoke English. His name was Samoset. Shock rippled through the settlement, English words, spoken clearly, in a place they believed unknown to Europeans. Through halting conversation, they learned the truth. European fishermen and traders had visited these coasts for years. Disease brought unintentionally by those earlier contacts had ravaged the local population, emptying villages long before the Mayflower arrived. The land was not untouched, it was wounded. Days later, Samoset returned with another mantisquantum, known as Squanto. Unlike anyone the English had encountered, Squanto understood their world intimately. He had been captured years earlier, taken to Europe, learned the language, and somehow survived to return home only to find his people gone. Squanto became their guide, interpreter, and teacher. He showed them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, how to navigate local waters, how to survive in a land that had already proven lethal to outsiders. Without him, there is little doubt the colony would have collapsed entirely. An uneasy alliance formed with the local Wampanoag leader, Massasoit. Mutual fear held both sides in check. The English needed food and knowledge. The Wampanoag needed allies against rival tribes. A treaty was signed, fragile as the wooden walls of the settlement itself. But the danger was far from over. The Mayflower still sat offshore, her role unclear. She had delivered her passengers, but now she lingered, waiting. Some wondered whether she would return to England, carrying news of failure. Others feared abandonment. What would happen if the ship sailed away and left them completely alone? As spring turned toward summer, the surviving colonists began to regain strength. Crops took root, shelters improved, death slowed. Against staggering odds, the settlement endured. But endurance came at a cost few could have imagined when they first boarded the ship. When the Mayflower finally departed in April 1621, she did not carry the triumphant news of success. She carried absence, empty berths, unmarked graves, and the knowledge that what had begun as a flight from persecution had become something far larger and far more dangerous than anyone had intended. The ship sailed east. The consequences of her voyage stayed behind. What followed would shape not just a colony, but an entire continent, and not all of it would be remembered kindly. By the time the surviving Pilgrims faced their first full year on Cape Cod, the enormity of their gamble became impossible to ignore. They had escaped persecution, navigated an ocean that had swallowed countless ships, and survived brutal storms that would have killed less determined men and women. Yet survival had brought them only to the edge of the unknown. The land was harsh, food was scarce, winter had taken almost half of their number. Every decision from this point forward carried weight not just for their lives, but for the legacy of their people. The Atlantic had already tested their courage once, and it had demanded everything the Pilgrims had to give. The Mayflower had carried them through months of uncertainty, threatening collapse at every wave. But leaving England was only the beginning. Each new day in America presented challenges that threatened to undo all they had endured. Storms, hunger, exposure, disease, any one of these could end the fragile experiment in survival. Winter lingered longer than expected. Snow and frost hardened the soil, making planting nearly impossible. The settlers had little more than faith and determination to sustain them, along with the limited knowledge shared by Squanto. Every seed planted was a gamble. Every building erected with raw timber tested the limits of human endurance. And yet they persevered because turning back was no longer an option. England, with its Church of England, its legal authorities, and its persecution, had become a memory too distant to reclaim. Tensions between the Pilgrims and the strangers never fully disappeared. They had been crammed together in the cramped hull of the Mayflower, but now the stress of survival and disagreement over leadership created new fissures. Some questioned the fairness of resource distribution, others the methods of governance outlined in the Mayflower Compact. Arguments flared over the allocation of labor, the care of the sick, and even religious practices. Every decision was a potential spark that could ignite open conflict. One day, as a group of men fished in the icy harbor, a sudden scream echoed from the shoreline. A small child had disappeared, swept into the water by a rogue wave. The men leapt into action, wading into the freezing waters, driven by desperation and fear. Against all odds, the child was pulled from the surf, shivering and unconscious but alive. The moment reminded everyone that life here was a fragile, unpredictable treasure, one that could vanish in seconds. By spring, crops finally began to take root. Corn, beans, and squash grew in the small fields cleared near the settlement. Fishing became more productive, hunting provided meat to supplement meager supplies. The survivors began to recover some of the strength lost over the brutal winter. Yet even with growth, the shadow of mortality never fully lifted. The memory of those buried during the dark months remained with the living, a silent testament to the stakes of every decision. Diplomacy became as vital as survival skills. The Wampanoag, under Massasoit, were watchful allies, but one misstep could undo years of fragile trust. The Pilgrims learned quickly that understanding, respect, and careful negotiation were essential not only for trade but for safety. A miscalculated move could invite attack or isolation, undoing everything their journey had accomplished. It was in this delicate balance that the Pilgrims began to imagine permanence. The settlement was no longer just a refuge. It was a beginning, a seed of what might become something far larger than anyone could have predicted. Yet the Atlantic remained a silent, haunting presence, a reminder of the journey that had brought them here. The Mayflower had carried them across a perilous expanse, leaving behind England and a world that no longer welcomed them. Its absence was felt every day, a ghostly witness to the courage and despair that defined this fledgling colony. The lessons they had learned at sea now applied ashore: patience, resilience, and a unity born not of choice but of necessity. Each structure built, each crop sown, each interaction with indigenous neighbors was an extension of that perilous voyage. And yet, even as spring blossomed and hope grew, the unknown still loomed. Winter would return, other threats would emerge, and every decision remained a test of endurance. By the end of the first year, the surviving Pilgrims had established a foundationist settlement that, though precarious, demonstrated human tenacity in the face of almost unimaginable odds. Their story, however, was far from over. What began as a flight from religious persecution had become a journey of survival, endurance, diplomacy, and eventually adaptation. They had crossed the point of no return. There would be no turning back, and the consequences of their arrival would ripple across generations, reshaping history in ways they could never have foreseen. The story of the Mayflower is more than a tale of a ship. It is a story of ordinary people confronting extraordinary uncertainty, of fragile structures withstanding relentless pressure, and of faith, courage, and resilience defining the destiny of a new world. It is a testament to what humans are willing to risk when hope outweighs fear, and it reminds us that history is not shaped by inevitability, but by those who dare to sail into the unknown. For centuries, the name Mayflower has become synonymous with endurance and determination, but the truth behind it, desperate, human, fragile, remains as compelling today as it was in 1620. Every plank of wood, every prayer whispered into the cold night, every risk taken on that voyage contributed to a story that would echo far beyond the Atlantic. And what began as a fragile experiment in survival became the seed of a nation.